There is, as there always is, but stick with us, the parallel universe in which none of this is happening and something else is. In this specific instance, it would be a parallel universe in which Russia did not attack Ukraine for no good reason 3 years ago, or indeed 11 years ago. As long as we're enjoying ourselves, consider the parallel universe in which Russia has devoted that same time, energy and resources to actually building the great nation of President Vladimir Putin's fevered imaginings, rather than ploughing a generation of its youth into Ukraine's sunflower fields in the service of some inane imperial fantasy. The point here being that this parallel universe would be a happier one for countries beyond Ukraine and Russia. Russia's rampage in Ukraine has had knock-on effects elsewhere, few, if any of them, positive. Georgia is divided between a pro-Russian government and a broadly pro-European people. Belarus has seen its interminably serving tyrant entrench himself even further. Moldova, outside the EU and NATO and partially occupied by Russia, lives with the threat of being next on the Kremlin's list. The Baltic states have been forced to consider that EU and NATO membership may not be enough. This special episode, recorded at the recent Munich Security Conference, reflects on all of the above and more. Where are the limits of Russia's ambitions? What means of resistance are available? And should we all have paid more attention to the countries living closer to it? This is the Foreign Desk.
It is not a crisis following elections just because they were fraudulent and stolen. This is an existential crisis because nobody in Georgia wants to see Georgia going back to the Russian domination.
When Lukashenko is serving to Putin's interest, not to interest of Belarusian people and nation, it will be a constant source of threat.
Because he is able to remain in power despite all the losses, then that's all what he cares about. He doesn't care about human suffering.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is the President of Georgia. Salome Zourabichvili was elected in 2018, and the role is presently disputed. Georgia's pro-Russian parliament has installed a new president, former Manchester City striker Mikhail Kavalashvili. President Zourabichvili has refused to stand down and is calling for new elections. I began by asking President Zourabichvili whether leaving Georgia was, all things considered, a risky endeavour. More than one leader in roughly her position has seen the locks changed in their absence.
I don't know, and I'm not calculating the risks like that. I think there are risks today in Georgia for everyone, probably including me. But nobody's stopping in front of the risks, so I'm in the same position. We have to do our jobs, and the people on the streets that are protesting are taking much more risks, and they're still protesting, and they're still going to continue. Because what I think is very important is to know and to understand is that this is not a regular political crisis in Georgia. It is not a crisis following elections just because they were fraudulent and stolen. This is an existential crisis because nobody in Georgia wants to see Georgia going back to the Russian domination.
But on that thought of it being an existential crisis, do you see the current trajectory as moving towards some sort of showdown? Because historically in other countries where you have a situation where two people say they're president, that usually doesn't end calmly.
No, because we do not have this situation. The other one doesn't even say that he's president or act like a president. We're really in a situation where there is a standoff, not a showdown, a standoff between the society, the nation that doesn't want to go back to the Russian domination, and a ruling party that is basically today a one-man party with not a legitimate parliament, no legitimate government, not even the pretension of a legitimate president, a government that is not governing, that is just directing a repressive apparatus. That's what we have today. So it's a standoff, and it's not going to turn to a showdown because the population is very conscious of the fact that we are in a specific geopolitical situation. We have two occupied territories. We have have Russian troops on the occupied territories, 40 kilometers from Tbilisi. So that's why this movement is extremely peaceful, without any other calls but the demands for new elections, and by now the demand to release the political prisoners, the conscious prisoners that have been taken as hostages during these protests.
I mean, I want to come back to that question of the Russian presence in Georgia, because obviously there are echoes of that in Ukraine, which is the big talking point of this conference.
We are the other coin of the crisis in Ukraine.
Well, indeed so. But in terms of the ruling party, this is Georgian Dream, the plaything of Bidzina Ivanishvili. What do you sense is their actual angle? Are they acting out of some conviction that this is their idea of Georgia and that they do represent at least a portion of the people of Georgia because people did vote for them? Or
they do not exist. They do not exist. There is nobody thinking beyond Mr. Ivanishvili. He is dictating the decisions. He is the one man taking all decisions, including the decisions that govern his own wealth, like the offshore law that is designed to allow him to bring back assets he owned the other offshores and bring it back to Georgia without paying any taxes. And that's the way Georgia is non-governed today.
But do you think he is acting out of just total self-interest, or is he a Russian asset in some respect?
That's something that tomorrow's historians will have to define. Probably there is a mixture of all of that. He has spent 30 years of his life or more in Russia, probably has links or compromats, as they used to say, because he has been there at the time when nobody was doing business in a normal way. So there's a mixture of everything, and it's very difficult to say which one is the more important. The fact is that he's playing the Russian card, and he's playing it by himself, and he has become, even if he was not maybe before, he has become a Russian proxy.
But to return to that question of the Russian presence in Georgia, obviously the big fear hanging over this conference is the idea that Ukraine might be sold out, might be forced into an unjust peace, that Russia might get to keep what it has taken. If that happens, how concerned...
No, let's put things straight. That's not the situation. The situation is that Russia has not been able to win the war over Ukraine. It might be today saying that it's going to win the peace through some deal with Trump or something, but that's a presentation of the facts. The reality of the facts is that over 3 years now, 24th of February, Russia has not been able to win the war. It's a major defeat for Russian prestige, for Russian military, for Russian objectives as they were defined when Russia invaded Ukraine. So that's where we start with.
But, I mean,
now, what is Russia doing? And that's what I said, we are the other face of the coin.
Sure.
Russia is seeing that this military strategy has not worked or has been very costly. Even if Russia doesn't care about human cost, it has been very costly. The return of the soldiers will be extremely costly. It has been costly in terms of destruction to the Russian equipment. They've been forced to bring North Koreans, and so on and so forth. Now Russia is designing another alternative, which is winning countries over through elections, through proxies. And Georgia is a testing ground. We've had elections that were inspired and designed according to a Russian methodology, the same way as Romania's TikTok methodology was not a Romanian methodology. I'm not saying that Russians were there to implement everything, but we've had a huge call centers, use of private personal information lists that we heard 3 weeks ago that they are now disseminated all over Europe, these personal informations about Georgian citizens, and many other methods. It was a group of methods that was used for the elections. Russia is testing that through proxies in Georgia. If it works, it means that Russia has an alternative strategy to win countries, and especially win countries where it's most interest around the Black Sea. So that's Georgia, that's Romania, that's Moldova.
Well, just finally then, you spoke earlier about the resolve and the determination and the courage of the protesters we have seen demonstrating in recent months. And in recent months, I think it's worth remembering when the weather in Georgia is not necessarily encouraging to spending long nights out in the streets.
We have gone through the worst.
But
then comes spring.
Well, hopefully metaphorically as well as literally. But are you optimistic that that is going to be enough, that if this is left up to Georgia's people to do it themselves, that they can actually do this with Russia bearing down on them?
I'm sure that it's up to the Georgian people to do it by themselves. Nobody in Georgia believes that anybody else is going to do it instead of them. What they need is moral support, is attention, more attention. That's what I'm here for, to explain what's happening and to say that we need to be on the map because we are an important place. Even if it maybe today doesn't look like that because there is a major war going on, and clearly that deserves the whole attention. But I think that people, because it's vital and because it's existential and because that has been the fight of Georgia for all the centuries it has existed, more than 20, and that's the reason why Georgia exists today, because when it's existential, then people go to the end.
That was President Salome Zourabichvili of Georgia. This is the Foreign Desk. You're listening to the Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Belarus held a presidential election in January. As has been the case with every presidential election Belarus has held since becoming independent in 1991, it was won by Alexander Lukashenko. He took extra care this time to ensure a lack of viable opposition, a response to 2020's election when he got a bit of a fright. He imprisoned his likeliest rival, Serhiy Tsikhanouski, but his wife, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, ran in his stead. She is now exiled. He remains in prison. I began by asking Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya if she knew anything about her husband's whereabouts or condition.
Actually, no, situation hasn't changed since then. On the 9th of March, it will be 2 years since I haven't heard about my husband at all. No letters, law is not allowed, and I don't know where he is, in what state he is. If he alive, also don't know. So the situation, of course, is dire. We have dozens of people who are held incommunicado in the same state. So it's a type of torturing people. And, of course, we want more actions from our democratic partners and institutions, who have mandate to deal with such cases with incommunicado modes, to act more publicly, openly, decisively, but still no information. And of course, this uncertainty, it's really exhausting.
Has it become more difficult, though, to keep attention focused on it? Obviously, at this event we're speaking at, the focus is going to be all about Ukraine and Russia. Is it hard to keep people interested in Belarus as well? Are people forgetting it's there?
Of course, Belarus wasn't much in focus recently, but honestly speaking, these talks about possible negotiations in Ukraine, they are also should include Belarus. And today we have heard that President Zelensky mentioned that he is going to talk to President Trump about Belarus because there are concerns that Russia might deploy thousands of new soldiers in Belarus to blackmail Western countries, to blackmail Europe. So we have to remind constantly about strategic importance of Belarus in this geopolitical crisis. Don't look at Ukraine as on Iceland, that is not surrounded by other countries who are also threatened by imperialistic ambitions of Russia, like Belarus and Moldova, and some others. So without free and democratic Belarus, this crisis cannot be solved because our territory, when Lukashenko is serving to Putin's interests, not to interest of Belarusian people and nation, it will be constant source of threat. Migration attacks, nuclear weapon, different drills, so it will be constant turbulence. So make Belarus not a problem, but part of the solution of this crisis.
But on that subject, there was, of course, recently a presidential election in Belarus, and listeners can for themselves insert the inverted commas around election. But this was the first time Lukashenko had got himself re-elected again since the presidential election in which you stood in your husband's place in 2020. 2020, 2021, there were, of course, huge protests in Belarus against, what was fairly obviously a fraudulent election. Not so much this time. Is there any active civil opposition left inside Belarus, or has it been successfully repressed completely?
Look, there are millions active Belarusians inside the country. But I want to remind you that living 4 years in Stalin's time era, when repressions are continuing, that every day 10, 15 people are being detained. So at this ritual that Lukashenko created for himself and reappointed himself against the will of Belarusian people, I don't ask people to go to the streets. I don't want new political prisoners. I don't want new sacrifices. I ask people, save yourself for real moment of opportunity, because this Lukashenko's farce, it's only for him. It's not for the country. He will not change the policy, for Belarus. But when there is a possibility that might be connected with the situation with Ukraine or some economic issues or internal coup d'etat, we can't exclude this, or some other black swans situation. You have to be prepared. So that's why I want to deliver the message to democratic world that rallies or visible uprising, it's only part of resistance, part of revolution. Because all these years, people are not just sitting and waiting, when something happens, or, somebody will come and save us. People hold underground acts of sabotage, underground resistance. They provide from inside the country information what's happening there. Because, people isolated inside Belarus and people who had to flee the country were also in some isolation because, connection between Belarusians is broken because of all the restrictions, but people find solution. People watch free media. People provide us information. Even we have many informants from inside the regime. They provide us information how, for example, sanctions are circumvented, provide us data and papers, how regime is militarizing our economy. It's very dangerous. People can be sentenced to years and years in jail, for providing this information, but people are doing this, and so it's about people not giving up. But we are fighting for democratic changes. We believe in democracy. We believe in European and democratic values. And we really want to see that countries who are based on these values are ready to protect them, not only on their lands, but also help those who are fighting for those values. And I don't want people to stop believing in democracy, that democracy is powerful, democracy has enough tools and can use these tools effectively in fight against tyranny. So this is important. It's not Belarusian issue or Ukrainian issue. It's not only issue of our nations. It's the issue of the whole democratic world. Do you have strength and decisiveness to protect these values? This is the question. No one war and no one fight cannot be won if you're alone.
Just finally then, you've been at this quite a while now. It's probably quite strange to think that there is a parallel universe somewhere in which you might just have been re-elected to your second term of president of Belarus. Does your optimism ever waver at all? Do you always wake up every day thinking there's still something we can do, we will still win this eventually?
Of course, there are moments of disorientation, of when you're exhausted, you don't understand what else you can do or where world is moving, but you know that you just have to stand up and do your job. Because political prisoners in Belarus, they are relying on us. They believe in democratic world, in power of this world, and you can't betray beliefs and expectations. And I think if every leader of every, at least, democratic country would think in the same way, that it's my obligation, it's my responsibility. I have to do, I don't have to betray principles, values, and continue, fight with tyranny. And actually, it was in Trump's inauguration speech that he told that we have to, one of the priorities is fight against tyranny. So we are in full alliance, with these narratives. You can't defeat tyranny while nations who are at the front line of this fight might be given as price, to Putin. Or we in the Ukraine and Belarus, we are not the cake that can't be cut, this piece, to Russia, or this piece to Ukraine or Europe. We are sovereign nations who want to preserve our independence and sovereignty. And of course, we rely on the strongest of this world. We are part of your family, democratic family. So families have to protect, its members.
That was the Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. US President Donald Trump is not the first occupant of his position to suggest that Europe should spend more on and think harder about its own security. His administration has, however, done so with more menace and less tact than any previous. Our next guest is Kersti Kaljulaid, President of Estonia from 2016 to 2021. I began by asking if she was concerned that the United States may be less interested in keeping Russia out of Europe than it might once have been.
I think they're interested in really getting Europeans to pay to keep the Russians out. And if you also think that the defense Peter Hegseth went to Warsaw, praised Poles for spending and aiming to spend 5%. We in Estonia are also aiming at 5%, sitting at 3.7 or something right now. Everybody else in East is also spending quite a lot. Then, as during the Trump's first time, we don't mind if somebody reminds everybody to spend more. But of course, the general ecosystem where this Trump's second presidency is starting is totally different. I mean, there is war. And during the war, messaging has to be maybe a little bit more cautious. So I remember also from Trump 1, in the beginning, it was quite sinusoid. I mean, the feelings and how it felt. So later it settled. I think the same will happen. But of course, it's nerve-wracking for everybody during this time because of this time with what we are living.
It's something we've not spoken about before, because when we've spoken before, it hasn't seemed all that relevant, but it has become relevant again since Donald Trump was re-elected. You are among a very small coterie of people who know what it's like to interact with Donald Trump as president to president. When you spoke to him, when you were both presidents of your respective countries, what sense did you get of his level of interest in the United States' historic role of European protector?
I think he was very much interested to have big economic presence on this continent, hence his interest in Free Seas Initiative, which was at that time the only positive economic policy initiative which US and Europe in somehow shared. So I think this is indeed maybe the difference, that the interest is mainly there. And if we listen also to the discussions with Ukrainians, we hear that there is a hint of this kind of, we want to do business with you. If you can build on that, then of course you cannot do business with those who are not secure. So you can build on that trend and tendency, and I think this is how it should be done.
But would you have any advice you could pass on for European leaders now trying to bring him round to their way of thinking? I mean, when you're actually speaking to him, did you learn anything about how to, I guess, spark his interest in particular subjects?
Absolutely. I mean, if you have harsh numbers to back up what you are saying, like if you say you care about security, then spend, and then you are believed that you do spend. We spent already then 2%, and by 2016, when he came to power, we had been spending many years already. 2%, and we're going above. So basically, I mean, if you have these harsh numbers in place, then that's fine. And that was really appreciated and praised. And also when we celebrated our 100 years of republics, then I remember very well Donald Trump being very, very happy to meet and greet his Baltic allies in White House and saying that they have never let us down and they shall never let us down. So basically, you cannot do anything with words with him. That's the European problem. You have to really show, what you have to show for your words.
And it is going back a bit further, but you have also interacted president to president with Vladimir Putin of Russia. You said last year that his ambitions were nothing less than reconstituting Russia's empire. Does it surprise you that he doesn't appear to have been daunted at all by the last 3 years in Ukraine? This was a war that was supposed to take 72 hours.
I think because he's able to remain in power despite all the losses, then that's all what he cares about. He doesn't care about human suffering. This is very obvious. And this way, of course, he can tolerate this war. Unfortunately, we know that they still have quite many soldiers on their arms, maybe over 1 million even. So it is tough. But we have to make sure that we are able to make very clear that our red lines will hold, because we have our force to be able to contain him.
But does that remain the fundamental problem, though, that he's not going to stop until he is stopped?
Absolutely. But this has been very obvious for 3 years. And actually it was obvious, I would say, when he attacked Georgia. What did we do as a Europe?
Very little.
Quite to the contrary. Nicolas Sarkozy, who was then the president of the nation which was holding EU presidency, flew to Moscow, said, I've settled everything 40 kilometers from Tbilisi. So in his style, we would have settled everything 10 kilometers from Kiev. We were better this time, but we need to get even more better, much better.
So do you get the sense a bigger problem being stacked up here if Ukraine is bounced into some sort of peace which favours Russia, that Russia is allowed to keep what it has taken? Does that just store up greater problems further down the track, especially for countries in a position like Estonia?
I think if the agreement comes without the Ukrainian involvement or Ukrainians feeling that they were forced to something too much, then we have a problem. If Ukrainians will, take stock, calmly discuss and decide that for time being, at some point, the question, their own citizens might be asking is, it's burnt land. How many people need to die to get it back fully? I think this is a legitimate debate which only Ukrainians can have. And if they have come to the conclusion that temporarily they might accept a ceasefire and an agreement with security guarantees and not getting all their territories back, this is for them to decide. The problem is if they are not in the driving seat of this agreement, then we really have a problem, because then we will have a kind of a ceasefire which helps Russia.
That was Kersti Kaljulaid, former president of Estonia. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Moldova has spent a long time contemplating unhappy parallels with Ukraine's situation. It too is a former Soviet republic outside the EU and NATO, partially occupied by Russian soldiers. Unlike Ukraine, it is small, has a tiny military and is constitutionally committed to neutrality. Our next guest is Moldova's Minister of Defense, Anatoly Nosati. I began by asking if he was worried about what the consequences might be for Moldova if an unjust peace was forced on Ukraine.
Oh, definitely the situation in Moldova has direct impact on the situation in Ukraine, has a direct impact on the situation in the Republic of Moldova. We are neighbor countries, and all situation changes have a direct impact that is not only limited to the social or economical relation. It's all about the situation overall, specifically in security area.
But what options are available for defending Moldova now, if that's something that needs to be done? It's obviously a very small country with a very small military, and you have a constitution which commits you to neutrality under Article 11, which does limit your options for getting help from anybody else. So, practically speaking, what can you actually do?
So I would like to appreciate that you did not manipulate it on the provision of the Constitution. Definitely Constitution allowed to cooperate in order to develop the armed forces and security services to provide security for the nation. So definitely our partnership based on the bilateral relation, based on our cooperation with European Union states, with NATO, it's significant help us to improve our defense capacities.
But still, there's always going to be an upward limit on how much Moldova can be defended. Because if I've read that article of the Constitution right, you can't deploy foreign troops in Moldova. Other people can't send their own militaries to help you, or they can't NATO couldn't station troops on Moldovan territory, for example.
There is a different interpretation of this article of the Constitution, and it was very good explanation by Constitutional Court back in 2017. So the permanent station of the troops is not allowed. However, the activities that we conduct, like training activities, exercises, do not violate Constitution. And in this regard, it's only one state in the world who violate our neutrality. It's the Russian Federation, because they still have illegally stationed troops on our territory for the last 33 years.
I did want to ask about that, of course, because people have frequently made the comparison between the Russian troops stationed in Transnistria and the Russian troops that had been stationed since 2014 in Ukraine. Has that situation changed in the last couple of years? Are there still, as far as it's possible to tell, are there as many Russian troops in Moldova as there always were?
Sure, I would like to mention that the most important, they are not welcome in Moldova. They have nothing to do, because in accordance with international law and agreements, they had to be redeployed back in 1999, and later agreement was in 2004. But they still in Moldova, and they always trying to postpone this question regarding the withdrawals.
I mean, but do you see that resolving that situation as an important part of Moldova's future defence? If there is a means of somehow getting those Russians out of Transnistria?
Our national security strategy clearly identified the presence of uncontrolled territory and illegal station of the Russian troops on our territory as a threat to national security. So definitely in the process of reintegration of the country, in the process of the peaceful negotiation of the future of the Moldova, so withdrawal of the Russian troops, it's a must to be the first actions to have a successful process.
That was Moldova's Minister of Defence, Anatoly Nosati. This is the Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. If there is anywhere that Russia's assault on Ukraine might have been good, or at least not completely terrible news, it is Syria. Though Russia's commitments in Ukraine were not the only reason that the Russian-backed regime of President Bashar al-Assad collapsed in December, they were a reason. Our next guest had arrived in Munich more or less from Damascus, Tanja Fajon, Foreign Minister of Slovenia. I began by asking the minister about her recent meeting with Syria's new interim president, Ahmad al-Shara. Is she buying this apparent conversion from jihadist to democrat?
I had a long discussion in the palace in Damascus with the interim president. And I really believe we have to give a chance. There is a change, there is an opportunity, but it's up to this interim president and the interim authorities. I also spoke with the foreign minister, how they will manage to make this political transition a truly inclusive one, meaning how to include religious, ethnic minorities, vulnerable groups, including women. And that was also my message to the interim president. We expect a political transition that will be a very inclusive one. I think there is a general awareness that it is an opportunity. It will be not an easy one. There is still a question of the southeast of the country. There are still negotiations how really to include Kurds and how to have a control and really stability and inclusive process. But on the other hand, I think we also have to be aware that Syria currently needs some push from the international community. We have sanctions, American sanctions, European sanctions. Slovenia also supported on the EU level that we are gradually lifting the sanctions, but monitoring at the same time situation on the ground. So it will not be an easy process, but I think people there discussing, talking to them, Syrians are, I would say, cautiously optimistic.
Did you get a sense, though, of what the best approach from Western countries, Europe, the United States, might be in terms of trying to shape this in a positive direction? Is it going to be active involvement, or given recent history and the record of the Western world in trying to shape events in the Middle East, staying out of it and let the Syrians sort it out?
I mean, we have a conference in March, EU-Syria in Brussels, and I think there will be certainly a European active involvement. We need to support also when it comes to reconstruction, building public institutions and the system in the country. From banking on, everything has to be basically done from the scratch. So looking what are the contacts of the interim president and how much they are really going around building the allies, not only in the Middle East or within Gulf countries, but also with Lebanon or European countries, France, Italy, discussing with Trump. I think they really want to position themselves and they want to build the credibility. So once again, I say we have to give them opportunity.
I mean, do you perceive, and this is a horribly fate-tempting question, so I'm kind of apologising in advance, that this might actually be kind of a hopeful moment for the Middle East, in between the removal of Assad, the decapitation of Hezbollah, the retraction of Iran, certainly the diminishment of Hamas? Is there a space there in which something better can be built?
I do hope. We are following a very fragile ceasefire and rebuilding of the institutions and the state. We see also a very fragile ceasefire and a sign of hope in Lebanon. In Lebanon, we just got a new government. I met also in Lebanon, at that time still a designated prime minister who used to be leader of the ICJ court, so very committed to the justice and the rule of law. And we have there a Lebanon in president. So let's see, it's a fragile ceasefire with a president gives a lot of hope to rebuild the country. Also something that we have to closely monitor. But let's say Lebanon, Syria, some positive developments in the light of what we face still with Gaza, a lot of uncertainties. I sometimes believe it's a very pessimistic scenario what's happening to Palestinians with a terrible war, with being pushed out from Gaza Strip. Now even with indications they will have to be forcibly displaced to Jordan, to Egypt, which I strongly say it's something that is unacceptable and against the international law.
But is there anything Ukraine's European allies can do to stop the United States selling Ukraine out if that's what the United States is determined to do?
I mean, I don't want to now predict what's going to happen because what we hear are just the statements from one or another. But I see there are some movements to the direction. There is a willingness to have peace. There is a willingness to discuss. But Zelensky also very clearly stated recently that he wants first to stop Putin with daily attacking, sending bombs, distracting or destroying the infrastructure, etc. So this war has to stop, but it has to stop in a way that we don't force Ukraine to surrender, because that would be a very dangerous, I would say, historic precedent. No one can really, with a forced change internationally, recognize borders. If there is an agreement, it has to be with Ukraine and it has to be with Europeans.
But just a final thought on that. You were talking about a just peace, which is the same language, you're right, that President Zelensky has learnt. But is there a concern, or at least are you concerned, that if it is an unjust peace, then this is likely to tee up further and bigger conflict further down the line? I mean, I know everybody's already done the jokes about, European country under siege being betrayed at Munich, and last time that happened, it went badly.
Look, achieving the agreement means that both sides has to be at the table, and there has to be an agreement. What the agreement is, I think it's very clear. How we see this war is Russia is aggressor, Ukraine is a victim. And Ukraine certainly has the final say how the agreement shall be. And the agreement shall be the one that is acceptable for Ukraine.
That was Tanja Fajon, Foreign Minister of Slovenia. And that's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin, with editing assistance from Elliot Greenfield and Flynn Simons. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer, which this week was edited by Steph Chungu. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.